You're taking the time out of your day. My name is Raina Sims. I'm Associate State Director of Outreach and Advocacy for AARP Ohio. And I have the pleasure of speaking with you today with Columbus City Council Member at Large for District 7, Councilmember Otto Beatty III, as well as Alex Von Delling, Principal with Opticos. And it's going to be our pleasure to speak to you this afternoon, speak with you in terms of accessory dwelling units and the insights and the strategies for successful implementation. And to give you a little background about that with regard to the work that AARP does, we know that Ohioans want to stay in their homes as they age because we all value our independence. And 87% of Ohioans age 45 or older very much want to stay in their current homes in the community where they are. And so it's important that we work together to be able to achieve that. And so that we look to know the vast majority of, or 88% of Ohioans that are 45 years old or older, want to be able to get to places they need to go independently as they age. So it's important for us to continue to work together, to learn from one another as we listen to Councilmember Beatty and Alex this afternoon. And then just to give you a little bit more feedback, some of you may or some of you may not know, the state of Ohio is now an age-friendly state. The governor actually signed an AARP Ohio agreement where the state of Ohio is age-friendly. So that means that the designation is a state designation. Each individual municipality does have the opportunity to be able to initiate their own age-friendly initiative where there are 7 domains that are or 8 domains, forgive me, within age-friendly. But what we're going to do today is talk more about what we're going to do locally with the city of Columbus, and then what we can do more globally across the state in terms of ADU development. So to begin, I want to be able to now move into Councilmember Otto Beatty. If you could please begin your just what's going on with Columbus, where Columbus has started, where Columbus is in terms of ADU development.
Have done any of this without you.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you again to AARP. We couldn't have done any of this without you. Your role, and thank you for your role in helping citizens across our state and across our city. You know, I am Councilmember Otto Beatty, and I am proud to announce that next month, our council will be considering adopting legislation to allow for accessory dwelling units on a citywide basis. Given the size and age of our city, we already have accessory dwelling units in our city with carriage houses, extra units, and everything like that. But they're difficult to build. This particular legislation is going to make it easier so more citizens can build ADUs. I want to start off by talking a little bit about my individual background. Before I came to council, I was an attorney, a real estate developer, and had a long history, over 30 years, of dealing with real estate. I had never built an ADU. However, I have a personal story. And my personal story involves my own mother. My mother in her 80s lived across town from my sister and I, who were her primary caregivers. She loved her independence, she loved her neighborhood and everything. But we were in good communication with one another, and she reached out to us and said, you know, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stay in my home, but I couldn't imagine, you know, the cost, the expense, and everything associated with going to a nursing home. So my sister and I came up with the thought of how could we allow her to live closer to each of us, take the worry off of her, take the worry off of my sister. And so our solution was to convert my sister's garage, attached garage, to an ADU. And so the family, we pulled our money together, myself, my father, my sister, and even for my mom. And I remember the day when I said to my mom, "Hey, mom, we're going to need this extra money from you." And she said, "Well, I was setting that money aside for my long-term care." And we said, "Mom, this is your long-term care, an ADU." And so, you know, this wasn't in the city of Columbus. It was right outside of Columbus in a suburb. And we had a pretty good experience with that suburb, but there certainly were hurdles which lengthened the amount of time that we were able to take to construct our ADU. But it was a success. And my mother, again, has received, I believe that it's extended her life. She's closer to her grandchildren. My sister, who I would say would probably be the primary caregiver, feels much better and is able to get to her on a moment's notice. And at the same time, my mother has her own independence, her own entrance, her own kitchen, her own washing machine. And so she's able to remain independent as well and age in place somewhere where she is comfortable. So in addition to the real estate experience I have, I do bring a personal experience to the discussion. And so next, I want to speak a little bit about our journey in changing the legislation. And I step back. Columbus is the 14th largest city in the United States and one of the fastest growing cities in the Midwest. You know, we have a diversity of neighborhoods, new houses, older neighborhoods, older housing stock, a diversity of incomes, like you would expect in a large city. But we know that we don't have the housing stock to keep up with all the growth and opportunity that's coming to Columbus. And we probably can't build our way out of it. So our city has a goal of leaning into the innovation for a wide variety of solutions to add to the housing stock in Columbus. And ADUs serve a role in that. Some of our main goals, which you can see here, are to, affordable housing, diversifying housing types, and other things. Now, I made reference earlier to our current zoning code and its approving process. It starts off with Columbus, like most cities, the vast majority of lots and parcels are zoned single family. And just to make that simple, to oversimplify that, essentially, you can only have one dwelling unit per residential parcel in most areas. And if you seek to do more, to add an additional dwelling unit like an ADU, a full addition to your house or something like that, you then go into what's called a variance process. And this, as illustrated on the screen, is a lengthy process that for someone like myself who has experience in real estate and maybe as a developer, I'm used to this. I bring in experts, I bring in others. But to your average homeowner or single property owner who wants to do this to expand their property for additional income or add it or bringing in a family member, this can be quite daunting. And quite frankly, many of these homeowners who wanted to build an ADU just gave up. So when I came to council, given all these experiences, I had some objectives here for making ADUs available to more people. First, I wanted to make ADUs a recognized housing type in the zoning code and available in all residential areas. Secondly, which I made reference to before, we wanted to ease the process of being able to build an ADU. And the core of easing that process was eliminating the need to have to obtain variances. And third, provide some guidelines and regulations which were consistent with our city and community goals. If you follow these guidelines, fall within these regulations, you won't have to go through this complicated process. Now, of course, you still have to get permits. You still have to follow the building code and other things because you are building a living unit, but we wanted to make this easier for people to do this. So how did we get to where we are now, where we're just a month away from getting this legislation passed? The first thing we did was we researched and examined legislation from other cities in Ohio, as well as across the country. And AARP was a big help with that. I talked to legislators from states such as Arizona, city council people in other cities to find out what their communities, how their communities reacted to ADUs. And particularly when I spoke to those in the West Coast who've passed some of this legislation years ago, what were some of the outcomes? What were some of the outcomes and unintended consequences of allowing ADUs citywide in an easier process? We, of course, we engaged with many thought leaders, including AARP, but also architects, developers, homeowner communities, etc. And then we had a very extensive community outreach. As you see on the screen here, this is a card that we handed out quite often to allow residents in our community to provide feedback. But again, as much as I know, I had to get the experts involved, of course. So we interfaced in great detail several meetings with both our zoning department and many other city departments, service department. How will this affect trash? How will this affect fire? How this will affect public safety? How will this affect other things in the city? We developed a messaging strategy and communication strategy so we can interact more with residents and other affected stakeholders. And then finally, we worked with our zoning department to propose some draft legislation. We had a set process that went above and beyond to have both meetings with internal people, external people in the community, residents, and many, many others. And we've had a total of 2 public hearings and 1 more to go. Well, we had residents that came in, they told their individual stories about what they had to go through to complete an ADU or what discouraged them from creating an ADU. And we also heard from individuals in neighborhoods about some of the positive things they see and also what some of their fears and hesitations for ADUs coming into their community might be. As part of our process, we ran a community public feedback period of 60 days. And we continue to, again and again, reach out to my fellow council members and city departments because we have found that the residents, they go to who they know, the councilman that represents their area, the one that they've met before, the one that they have a great relationship with. And they are ferreting that information over to us so we can respond. And then our next step, we will come together with the guidance of the experts in the city, including the city attorney's office, and come up with a final version of the legislation. And as I mentioned, we are 1 month away from bringing this to a vote, and things look very positive. But as we've heard from citizens, this is just the first step. We dealt primarily with the zoning. Further steps that can be taken, and I know we'll hear more about this in the next presentation, is we will create a education and outreach plan for the public. Again, a little thing that's different here is, again, most of the ADU activity, as we've spoken to others around the country, they're taken on by ordinary citizens, not developers, not professionals, but ordinary citizens who are looking to utilize their personal property to enhance it for their personal use. We've also heard from residents that the current cost to build the ADU may be a disincentive. So we've looked in other communities and we're talking to others about what kind of incentive, grants, and other programs that we can utilize in order to encourage the construction of ADUs. In sum, as much as we believe that ADUs are best for our city, we have to engage with the public, with the experts, and with the community members. It must fit in to what's best for our community. But I encourage those of you that are watching to interact with your public officials, inform them how great of an initiative this can be. And I believe that when we look forward 4 to 5 years from now, we'll find ADUs in all neighborhoods across the country. Back to you, Rena.
Yeah, we're getting safe. Thank you very much, Councilmember Beatty. I appreciate your description of the steps that Columbus is taking, and congratulations on taking some great steps towards making this happen. I look forward to watching the progress, supporting you in the progress, as does our state office. I do want to take the opportunity to make sure that those of you that are in attendance today to again thank you. If you want to take the opportunity to just drop your name and your particular role with your city or municipality, whether you are a resident or planner's office or zoning, just take the time to let us know who you are in the chat. If you have any questions, you're welcome to post the questions in the chat there as well. We're going to try to hold those questions, bringing them live until the end of our presentation to make sure we address them fully. But if there are pertinent questions that have a sense of urgency, we'll try to make sure that we get those questions answered immediately. Like someone just asked, what does ADU stand for? Someone graciously responded, Accessory Dwelling Unit. So thank you very much. So we're going to keep things moving, and we're going to kick it on over to Alex, who is again principal at Opticos, and she's going to share some of the strategies that go into planning and working with municipalities and community members around ADUs. So Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rena. Let me get this shared. I think, are you seeing my notes? Oops, screen.
We are not. We just see your full screen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for joining today. AARP is a longtime collaborator with Opticos, as we have been, working with them to enhance their livable communities initiative throughout many different states. And today we are pleased and honored to be sponsored by AARP Ohio to share our knowledge and insights we've accrued through our years of working on ADU policy in multiple different types of communities across the country, both urban and rural. But I'll tell you a little bit about who Opticos is to start. We're based in California, Berkeley, California, and but we work in all different kinds of country, or all different states, and we have an office in Chicago as well. So we've done a lot of work in the Midwest. But we're a group of urban designers and architects and planners, and we partner with clients who really want to lead the way to creating these walkable communities that are vibrant and diverse. And, accessory dwelling units play a part in creating these kinds of places, as well as contributing to a diversity of housing options. And the information that I'm sharing in this presentation comes from our experiences of working with multiple cities and nonprofits across the country and helping them create and implement ADU policy. So what I'll cover a little bit today is I want to step back and look at what, a little bit of what we call missing middle housing and how ADUs are a part of that missing middle housing, which is really important for creating these kinds of walkable, diverse places. And then from there, the meat of the presentation will really talk about creating an ADU approach for your community, both from starting from like, hey, we're interested in it, all the way to like, how do you've passed your zoning, how do you actually, get it implemented? And then there should be some time for some questions at the end. So, we are all very aware of the housing issues the country is facing. And Opticos as a company has focused its efforts on advocating for missing middle housing as a solution to providing more housing choice and enhancing walking environments. So as a start, I want to highlight some of the reasons why this variety of housing, which includes ADUs, is so important to prioritize. How we define, and maybe a lot of you are familiar with the term missing middle housing, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we define it. And first and foremost, we talk about it as a form, which by design can provide good options for middle income population because they typically offer smaller homes on less land. And the form aspect is important about it because it's a way to add housing to single family zones that's appropriate to fit the scale of the neighborhood while also enhancing the access to walkable amenities. So our definition, first and foremost, is that it's house scale buildings with multiple units in a walkable neighborhood. And so why is missing middle housing important? And this photo is an example of a project that we've done in Nebraska that was all missing middle housing. So which it means is that all the units here are anything from 2 to 8 units, but it looks like a neighborhood. So, housing markets of every size are seeing unprecedented challenges, and there's a greater need for diversity of housing choice beyond just single family or large apartment buildings. And more people want to drive less, live in walkable areas. And last but not least, there's a need for more attainable housing pricing. But what I want to say is that, and I think Councilmember Otto had referenced this, that these building types existed historically in most residential communities, primarily before zoning was even implemented. And you can see examples in Columbus that we found that are really attractive, and they're typically in neighborhoods that have become very desirable. And while newer zoning doesn't typically allow for these building types to be included in single family zones, including ADUs, in many areas across the country, policy is really changing. And so that's exciting to see. And how do ADUs fit into this? You can see from this diagram on the left, we have a neighborhood, and you can see the little yellow buildings that often called carriage houses, are sort of tucked in behind the primary house or adjacent to the primary house in a way that's really appropriate to the scale of the neighborhood. And again, this is just examples, some historic examples. Like I mentioned, typically it was like a carriage house or a converted carriage house that was an ADU. And I should say, I know somebody asked the question, what's an ADU? It's often we've heard it called an in-law, a carriage house, granny flat. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that it has been named, but I think the code had created this term called accessory dwelling unit to be more comprehensive and a little bit more general. But to say this, they come in a lot of different forms. They could be detached, they can be attached. We even heard a council member talk about his garage conversion. So there's a lot of different kinds of configurations for consideration. And it's also many different groups of individuals throughout their life stages find this housing supports their needs. So it could be somebody who is a small family starting out and they need some extra income to help support their mortgage. A senior could be needing a little extra support, and that could be a place for the caregiver or a place that they can downsize into and have the primary house either rented out or have their adult children live there. So again, this is just some of the examples. I think the idea is that there are many ages of people that this housing type is beneficial for. Like everything, ADUs come with benefits and challenges. This is, just to start off with the benefits, while its construction is expensive, it's still more affordable than building a new home on a new piece of land because you're not paying for that new land. And the construction of an ADU is relatively simple. It also has flexibility to be a good infill development that fits existing scale, as I had mentioned, and works for life's different stages and provides potential income. On the flip side, some of the barriers that we're seeing are just that, again, Councilmember Otto mentioned this, that owners need to be the developer, and that has its own list of challenges. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we're helping homeowners navigate this. And then, just the fact that a lot of zoning doesn't allow this, or that the fees are really high and the process takes really long. And then the next hurdle tends to be just knowing the right builders to build it and how do you get the financing. So So we'll talk a little bit about how to get beyond those barriers as part of this implementation strategy. And I just wanted to point out that this image is from the National Association of Home Builders. They published this great publication that's free and downloadable about building smaller homes as a way to deliver more housing. And ADUs, we worked with them on this publication, and ADUs was one of the many approaches in that handbook, but it really has some good case studies and some good examples if you wanted to reference it. So now to talk about what is that approach? What does that look like? And before I start, I just wanted to point out that AARP has this really great handbook and that's also free and downloadable about ADUs. It just gives you a really great big picture about what they are. So it's great for outward facing, for community information purposes, as well as some more detailed information that's good for cities and builders and homeowners so that are interested in buying this. I do want to also mention another resource that AARP has out there and is available and free is a model ADU code. So for cities that are really just starting out, especially small communities that are like, I don't even know what to be considered, it's a really great template as a starting point. It doesn't mean that you have to follow it exactly, but as a starting point, it's really a good example for communities to use. So, a good starting point is understanding community interest and support, as well as their concerns and fears. And we've seen how Columbus is doing that, which is super. So just talk a little bit about ways of building community support. One of the things that we do quite frequently is organize walking tours in the communities that we've been asked to help adjust their code. And because as mentioned, normally it exists historically. And so it's a great way for people to see, oh, wow, I didn't even know this was here, even though now it's not currently allowed, let's say. And we do it for ADUs, but also for, larger, bigger scale of the missing middle housing. And it's just, the way to help get your community involved in being advocates and reduce the fear of, particularly for rental housing in these neighborhoods. And then again, Columbus has been doing this, which is super to hear. It's like the idea of community engagements, like having a series of workshops with the public. This can help understand the concerns, just general interest and willingness. But it also helps people feel like they're contributing and that they want to buy into this. So it's an important part of the process, we really believe. Okay, so now you've sort of built your community support, you want to kind of keep moving forward with this idea of allowing for ADUs. But what's this approach look like? And generally, it needs to be incremental. And that I say it's kind of like little steps that grow into something bigger. If I were to say, if someone were to ask me, what is the best process for getting the most ADUs built? And the barriers that you would want to take away from this are not requiring additional parking, that the owner doesn't have to live on the property, allow for 2 stories like you see in this image on the right, allow for separate ownership because that helps people build equity at a more affordable cost. And then also just the idea that it needs to be big enough that people could be a family living there. Again, these are strategies that help incentivize it, but we also know that many communities are not ready for this full-blown approach. So we're going to describe a process that's more incremental, especially for where residents have stronger concerns about allowing. And we'll talk about a more stepped approach. So one of the things, and this is another thing that AARP has been really great at sponsoring, which are these series of test fits in different communities. So this particular one was in South Dakota, where we helped a really rural small town envision what it could look like, what incremental additions could look like especially particularly in this case was for multi-generational housing. But the idea is helping people visualize what does it look like is really an important tool. So starting for the city to start with test fits is also important because you're looking at what are my typical lot sizes, and so then what's most likely going to fit. How am I going to manage the parking? where can the ADU go? And then, how much space do I need for it? So these were some, we worked with the city of Tucson when they were considering, now have an ADU policy, but this was part of their process. And just like, they knew they had in the center of town some smaller lots, but they also had alleys, and then more in the perimeter where they had larger lots. And so what were some of those examples and how could they look, which again were really great tools that were part of the community engagement and contribution to this process. So thinking about what are some areas that you can do steps in that will help, like again, do this as like kind of more incremental than just full blown, are ways to get people more on board, are considering these are 4 of the areas in which you can consider that. There's pilot projects. How do you handle the parking? How are you going to deal with whether or not you're requiring owner occupancy or even separate ownership? So we'll talk a little bit about each of these. I'd say for cities, pilot projects are excellent ways if there's like a large community concern. So how a pilot project works is that it can be used as a way to test a zoning change before it's been made citywide. So it can be done in a limited zone or for a limited period of time. And then the idea that's that, if there's support for it, that you can make it citywide. And this is an example of a community that tested out the idea of cottage courts, which were so popular with the community that they became part of the permanent code. So there's like actually a code for cottage courts as well as ADUs in their community. Parking is usually a pretty sticky issue, and many residents have big concerns about increased parking challenges. So it can be difficult to meet the traditional parking requirements, especially if the location where the parking garage is located is being converted into an ADU. Like you can see on this top image where this back was probably a garage, but they wanted to make it into an ADU. So where do you put parking? And so in working with the city of Tucson to implement ADU policy, we offered ways to think about providing parking more creatively. Does that mean reducing some of the amount that you're requiring, allowing for tandem? You can see in this case, we said the primary house could have tandem parking, and then the supplemental parking for the ADU is at the rear. Do you count street parking? Because there's so much, in these bigger lots, they have a fair amount of street parking. So it's not that we're saying to eliminate parking altogether. It's just, can you think a little bit more creatively about how you're allowing people to park that's realistic to the way they live? So one typical community worry is that if owners are not living in the property, there's no one managing the typical concerns people have for renters about noise and maintenance. Yet mandating owner occupancy is really a challenge for cities to enforce, especially like as the homes turn over. So in most communities we worked with, we started out with this requirement, this as a requirement in their ADU policy. But as ADUs have become more familiar and popular, we're seeing this requirement get eliminated. So one initial approach can be to require it for maybe like the first 3 to 5 years. And then planning council can vote to extend that requirement if they feel that it's important and successful, or just let it lapse because they want to encourage more of this housing to be built, and that's being identified as a barrier. I mentioned a little bit about separate ownership. Allowing for ownership is a way to provide more affordable entry into home ownership. And as this isn't typically allowance from the start, just planners and homeowners need to plan for this ahead of time. And one example is just making sure that you're providing for separate utilities in this scenario. And just like even thinking a little bit more broadly, these scales of these neighborhoods typically allow for or have duplexes and townhouses. And so, opening up the ADUs to being allowed for these types, a townhouse might have a detached garage in the back that could accommodate an ADU over it. So it's just another way to encourage more of it to be built, not just for single family homes. And again, I mentioned they're just more affordable entry homes. And so it's a way to get starter homes going. Okay, so now you've passed your policy, you've implemented your policy, but they still have to get built. And so, there's still more barriers to consider to kind of move this needle forward. Again, we heard council member talk about who that, it's not, we don't usually have a savvy developer who is the one who's like developing these. They're typically homeowners and they don't know very much about construction. So the more resources about the process the city can provide, the more efficient and cost effective it is for the homeowner. And it sounds like Columbus is considering this, but we do a lot of these kind of sort of roadmaps and guidebooks to ADUs for cities that really helps. It's like a comprehensive process documents that can be an informational resource and provide a homeowner with like a step-by-step process for developing their own ADU. And, they include information about planning and zoning, but also typically include additional resources and an understanding of the overall costs to consider beyond just like plan check fees and construction costs, because there are a lot of like what people might call hidden costs. Many cities now are talking about offering pre-approved plans, and there's a variety of ways to approach this. The city can hire an architect to deliver one or several plans, and then the homeowner has access to this plan for free. The limitation is this, that, there might be a style that it's limited in the number of style or sizes that it offers, but and it's kind of like that's why the test fits come in and are really important. But, we've worked with several cities in California to develop this offering. And so they've just become live fairly recently, and we're really curious to see how much uptick there is in this. But another alternative is for the city to do outreach to designers and for them to submit a few of their plans for pre-approval, and then have the homeowners go through those designers directly. So the city becomes the sort of clearinghouse for it, but they don't have to manage that process. It's the homeowners working directly with the designers. So the city of Tucson, for example, through a grant from AARP, had a competition, and they picked the top 10 designs to go through this process. They were voted on both by the city and by the residents as their favorite designs. And so now, you can go and look on Tucson's website, and they'll have these homes posted. And then how do you go directly to those designers? There's still typically a use fee because it still involves time with the designer, but it's way less reduced in time and cost. So, these are two ways to approach building plans, but other ideas to incentivize it, even without pre-approved plans, are offering a more expedited approval process. Like, do they get to go to the head of the line, or discounted permit fees as well? Because again, the cost can add up. And I mentioned like hidden fees. These are another fees that like can be pretty substantial for homeowners. And so we're often encouraging cities as like maybe an initial incentive to eliminate them for a time period, or at least at a minimal amount. They should be reduced to be proportionate of the size of the ADU. A lot of times they're just like the same fee no matter how big or small the unit is. And I just going back to that about like a little bit about impact fees, they're usually things that are supporting other amenities in the city, like schools and utilities. But so they're important, but it's also a way to just make it again relationship to the ADU to be more cost effective. I mentioned utilities, and one of the things about utilities is that the separate utilities can be super expensive to install as part of that site work. So maybe not mandating that they have to have separate utilities, but just informing the homeowner of the trade-offs, because they can keep the costs of the maintenance separate, but if they are able to afford them at the upfront. And lastly, financing. Loans for both construction and mortgage have traditionally been difficult, as banks historically have not allowed or counted income from ADUs. But this is changing. And now the Federal Housing Finance Agency allows for that income to be from an ADU rental to be counted towards the income to qualify for a loan, which is really making it easier to acquire these loans. So just, very briefly to say this, there are some additional considerations beyond the construction, beyond the zoning that come up in communities a lot with citizens and like how to address those concerns. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about those that we've seen in these sort of community engagement. And, probably you're all aware that this biggest concern tends to be about allowing ADUs and how to manage the short-term rental concerns. And while this option provides an avenue for additional income, which is great, and for flexibility for the homeowner, because it doesn't have to be rented 100% of the time, it does not necessarily support permanent housing needs in that community. So there's like a handful of different ways that we've seen communities managing this. And some require that the homeowner be living on the site. So that people feel like this will help manage, concerns about noise and just, behavior. So that's one way. Some people don't allow short-term rentals for shorter than 30 days at all because they're really trying to prioritize that permanent housing need. And then other places want to do some sort of hybrid. So they're allowing residents to apply for a limited number of permits that allow, like through a lottery system that allow short-term rentals, but have an expiration after which the homeowner would need to resubmit for another permit or go back through that lottery system. But I will say that the challenge for the city is largely having the resources to reinforce these policies around short-term rentals. So you as a city need to kind of consider that as well. And then, we talk about affordable housing, and a lot of times affordable housing, specifically means that there is an income that it's for people that have below a certain AMI income. And so how do we incentivize this ADUs to be rented to people of this economic strata? And so what we're finding that the best way to do this is to provide financial incentives that encourage the homeowner to rent that homes at a certain affordable rate. And so as an example, we've seen, I think this was in Austin, Texas, we've seen nonprofits that have offered low interest rate construction loans and that have covered like the soft cost for design as well to homeowners if they agree to rent their homes for a certain number of years. And, it can range anything from 3 to 8 years, depending on the loan costs below the market rate. And so again, that's a way to kind of like boost the affordable housing within a community without having to go through like the traditional tax credit way, which usually comes out in a manner of more like larger affordable homes, like apartment buildings or a community of them. Accessibility, our work with AARP has really brought this to the forefront. How to accommodate aging in place is a common topic of discussion. ADUs are a great solution for this, especially for empty nesters that, maybe want to have their adult children and family live in the main house, or they want to, rent out the primary house as a source of income while feeling less isolated. So, however, accessibility is not a requirement of these units by the building code because they're in the residential code. But we're always encouraging those buildings to minimally consider how they would make their units adaptable for the future, if not fully accessible. And some of these considerations that we talk about are like making sure the entry can be, at grade, even if it's like sloped ground, because on one hand, you're trying to drain the water, but you want to have an easy access into the unit. And you want to make sure that you have clearances for people for mobility issues. It usually involves a slightly larger bathroom, making sure you can access the shower, and like having, ways to like put in grab bars and things like that too. So this isn't actually an example that we did for a couple, and the husband, an older couple, and the husband was developing MS, and he knew that over time he was going to need to have this. So he wanted to build this unit in the back of his son's house property. And so this was, a very simple plan that we developed that met all the accessibility requirements that they needed. Lastly, just another kind of really hot topic is sustainability and kind of planning for that in the future. And detached ADUs and their simple construction offer multiple opportunities for integrating energy efficiencies, that also have long-term cost savings for the homeowner. So anything could be anything from a high performing window to electric heat pumps that offer heating and cooling, either planning or providing solar panels, and simply designing for a passive approach with that could include, like, you can see this eave shades these windows. There's good natural light. So those are things that reduce your just use of your energy system naturally. And some communities provide rebates or incentives for these moves, and even some may require it for new construction. I know that's the case in many communities here in California. So with that, that concludes. Oh, actually, I just want to talk about, like, just as a reminder for you, these are the key takeaways that I hope that you get from this presentation. That ADUs are an ideal incremental step to address housing needs. It's an easy access for the community to get their head wrapped around. They're also one of many options for diversifying housing supply. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's a helpful step to getting people more familiarized with missing middle housing as a concept in general. So the idea of, like, a gentle density within your community that still works for people of many different ages. And as it provides a way for people to stay in their community and adapt to the various life stages and needs. But the key is allowing for this flexibility. So, and now I conclude with, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you so very much, Alex. I'm going to thank Councilmember Beatty as well. But what I want to do now is to make sure that we have the opportunity to address some of the great discussion questions that we have in the chat. Someone just posted that they'd love to get some of these materials. The free materials that that were mentioned by Councilmember Beatty and Alex are available on our AARP website. I dropped the web address in the chat, but aarp.org/ADU will give you a number of different printable, downloadable, you can order free copies of the ADU material that was mentioned here today. So there's, draft language, there's information about the different types of ADUs. So please feel free to visit that location for information. All of this material that we're discussing today in terms of ADUs and missing middle housing fits under our AARP livable umbrella. And that, again, is 8 domains of the community. So housing, transportation, jobs, all of this fits together, aging in place. So this all fits together very well under the livable umbrella, but specifically even age-friendly. This is absolutely an opportunity to have families remain together as they age in place. But I want to make sure that I get to some of these questions for there to be further discussion. So let me see if I can go back. I tried to make a note, but I didn't want to mess up any of the chats or inappropriately delete someone. So someone asked, Jacqueline Davis, she mentioned, based on studies thus far, what is the minimum size of site you recommend? So Councilmember Beatty or Alex, if you both like to respond to that.
Well, I'll just say, in the communities that we've worked in, we've found that we can, do it on really small lots, like 3,500 to 4,000 square feet, because those smaller lots typically have had smaller homes on them. So I think there's ways to be creative. It's just that the scale of it adjusts accordingly. So I don't know if in Columbus you've been finding anything differently. Your lots may be larger as well, but
well, we have a wide variety of sizes of lot. And so one thing that in drafting the legislation and also working with our zoning and building department that we focused on is first of all, we looked across the country and saw what other communities were doing. And we saw everything from limitations of 700 square feet all the way up to 1,500, all the way up to things. So we really more focused actually on the number of ADUs that you could put in into a backyard, and we only allowed them in the backyard. And then we wanted to make sure not only was it accessory to the primary house, but smaller than the primary house. And so we've had that raise, and so we focused on some size, height, yard ratio, and other things like that. But it was in proportion to the primary house, making sure that it was subservient in size to the primary house. Because things that we had seen in our research that in some places such as California and otherwise where, there were instances where you had the primary house and then the ADU or the multiple ADUs were almost like having a small apartment complex in the back and everything like that. We felt that in our community, since this was a new and we were proposing this as soft density coming into the community, that it had to be something that was subservient to the primary house.
Yeah, another thing I'll point out is like even in our work in Tucson, we were finding that we were requiring, it wasn't actually changing your development envelope. We were still saying you had to match the amount of open space and the setbacks, right? And so even within that, we were able to fit the ADUs in the lot sizes. So and from that perspective, because there's often a lot of concern, oh, you're paving over everything, you don't have the open space. But in reality, we were still meeting the city's requirements that were in place and not having to change those. So.
Rita, I think we're ready for the next question.
Sorry, I was talking again. Rookie move with the mute on. One of the things that has shown to be important to our community members, to our volunteers, to those that you've spoken with that I've seen at city council meetings for a number of different municipalities is the cost, the affordability of housing in general. So one of the important questions that I've seen amongst all the questions which are important in the chat is, are there nonprofit community developers actively assisting with the development and construction of ADUs? And I wondered if you could both speak to that.
Council member, have you partnered with any nonprofits at this point for that? I can speak to it after if you have any.
Well, let me speak to one more thing on the last question that I omitted. When we were studying codes across the country, we also saw that many, particularly in smaller communities, they handled the accessory dwelling units along with other types of accessory buildings. And so you would find these codes that would define sheds, garages, and everything. And so they really came up with something that was very consistent on how something would be placed in a backyard, regardless if it was going to be a full dwelling unit or not. Now, turning back to the issue of community groups, we've seen it in a couple of ways. When we mentioned that we were going to pursue this legislation, we were immediately contacted by a couple of nonprofit organizations or advocacy organizations who were interested in doing this. They had already been having small group meetings. They had already been informing members of the public. They were actually using the AARP materials, and they actually had a guidebook, a sprint guide. They called it the Sprint Guidebook. The group is called Convergence, a sprint guidebook on how to do an ADU. And so these citizens had already started that particular process. Another thing which is interesting is in one of our earlier drafts, we spoke about, in one of the earlier drafts, we actually were contemplating an owner-occupier requirement in some of the residential districts, not all of them, but some of them. And what we had discovered is we found that there were nonprofit organizations that had either built ADUs or were contemplating building ADUs along with this housing that they were building in the community. For instance, in Columbus, Ohio, Nationwide Children's Hospital they're located in the south side of Columbus, and they have made a commitment in the south side, particularly in the south side and in another neighborhood, to provide housing. And they've partnered with smaller developers and others to do modular units, duplexes, single family homes, or whatever that could be rented out, and sometimes on a rent-to-own basis for moderate and low income individuals. They had actually done 2 units that actually had an ADU with it. And I can't recall if the ADU was for an extended family or if it was for some type of rental or a rental to a separate family. But that was a big driving force in us pulling away the owner occupied requirement, because we found that people were utilizing these nonprofits also wanted to expand their opportunity for these lots that they had control of to provide more housing.
Yeah, and just for our experience on like again of like how to incentivize affordable and whether you're working with affordable developers, I think the challenge is just really difficult when you say how the traditionally are funded and they have like, this pot of money that they need to be developing 120 units on this particular lot. And so really the strategy becomes, are there more lots that faith-based organizations own, that the city owns, as a way to kind of get around this, but deliver smaller scale affordable housing, right? And so those are some, like, how do you reduce the cost of the land? And I think I mentioned just like the idea is like, how do you incentivize the owner to rent to these people? And it's usually a financial incentive that's offered to them. So I think you just have to think a little bit outside the box and not necessarily go down the affordable housing developer traditional route for these types of buildings and specifically.
Okay. We do have a question. Kevin Stapleton has asked, have there been any concerns or support about ADUs being used for university student housing?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again, Raina?
Mm-hmm. Have there been any concerns or support about ADUs being used for university student housing?
Yeah, I can tell you that's like a big issue. Along with, in the communities we worked with in Tucson, for example, because it's at the ASU's there, that was like a huge concern. And so it's again, like some of that question becomes, do you require an owner occupancy in order to have that? Because the owner in the front would help, manage the ADU tenants. But a lot of it is like often that, there are other people who are not students who need housing, and this is often a good solution for non-student housing. And we often say like, well, if you had a single family house, that could be rented too. So you just have to think about, it's more of like a management and how much different offerings of housing do you have as a community as a whole. If you have a shortage, of course these are going to be used. So it's like, how does the students fit into your holistic picture is really how you have to look at it.
We are drawing close to time, and so I wanted to again thank both Council Member Otto Beatty and Alex, a principal at Opticos, for your time today. I wanted to make sure I gave you both the opportunity to leave some final thought. So if you both wanted to leave a little pearl of wisdom or some next steps for folks, what would that be? So, Council Member, I'll toss it over to you.
Sure, I think so. So first of all, I want to say to everybody on this call, please feel free to reach out and with any questions that you might have, etc. We'd be happy to share with you what we've experienced. I did want to say that the community engagement was very, very important. We were able to demystify some of the fears, allay some fears, but we also heard so many positive stories about people wanting to build ADUs, or those that had already accepted the challenge of building ADUs despite variances, despite cost, and how much it meant to their families in their communities. And we heard from the architectural community, the disability community, the youth community. It was the community involvement, and we actually, and I would, even with my professionals, we had a lot of learnings from the public engagement, things that we hadn't necessarily thought of. So that was a very important step in the process. And I think that once we get past this, we're going to have subsequent rounds of different legislation to advance and encourage ADUs based on the feedback that we've heard.
That's a great word. Thank you so much. Alex?
Yes, I too would like encourage anybody who wants to reach out with, if your question didn't get answered, more specific questions. And I think the presentation is going to be made available to everybody, correct? Yeah, so there's that aspect too. I just want to say that, I've been working on ADUs for 15 years now, and I'm so encouraged about how much momentum they've gotten nationwide. It sort of seems exponential. And I just want to tell people, like, you don't need to get it perfect or all in from the start, because it's alive, it's evolving. We've seen this over and over, how communities are like getting the buy-in, and it's, how it all changes. So I don't want to let that be stymie people. Just again, it's just like, can you start to allow it in little incremental steps? And then really make sure you're using so many communities have been going through this process, as we've seen in this discussion, and making sure that you're using other communities and nonprofits as your partners to help you through. And AARP, of course, is just a wonderful supportive advocate for this. So I just want to encourage people to continue with this process.
Well, thank you so much to our guest speakers for your time, for your commitment, for your desire to continue to help our community members age in place, and to share your wealth of knowledge and your process to date. I just thank you so much. To those who were in attendance today, I hope this was of value to you. Absolutely, to hear our speakers are absolutely willing to speak with you beyond today's event. I dropped the AARP resources in the chat as well. For more on ADUs, aarp.org/ADU for more on age friendly, and to find out more about how we are now an age friendly state. Please feel free to venture to our state of Ohio, aarp.org/Ohio webpage to find our press release for that. And then lots more at Livable and Age Friendly. We want to thank you for your time and best wishes as you all move forward with the ADU process, whether it's getting community feedback, pressing forward with legislation. We can all do this work together so that we can all age in places. We're going to have to do it one day. We can all age in place to the best of our ability on our own terms, safely in our own communities around our families that love us. So thank you all very much. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you.